Amelia Earhart, born July 24th, 1897. She disappeared July 2nd, 1937, and was declared dead January 5th, 1939. She was an American aviation pioneer. Earhart was born and raised in Atchison, Kansas, and developed a passion for adventure at a young age. Steadily gained flying experience from her 20s. In 1928, she became a celebrity after becoming the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic by airplane. In 1932, she became the first woman to make a nonstop solo transatlantic flight, and she was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her achievement. In 1935, she became a visiting facility member of Purdue University as an advisor in aeronautical engineering and a career counselor to female students. Oh, wow, I didn't know Purdue been around that long. I'm just now seeing commercials. She was a member of the National Women's Party and an early supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. She was one of the most inspirational American figures from the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s. Her legacy is often compared to that of the early career of pioneer innovator Charles Lindbergh, as well as the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, for their close friendship and lasting influence on women's causes. In 1937, during an attempt to become the first woman to complete a circumnavigational flight of the globe flying a Lockheed Model 10E Electrica plane, Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan disappeared near Holland Island in the Central Pacific Ocean. Oh, okay. And every time I hear about her story, it seems like she was alone. But here, she wasn't alone. The two were last seen in Lae, New Guinea, their last land stop before Holland Island, a very small location where they were intending to refuel. It is generally believed that they ran out of fuel before they found Holland Island and crashed into the ocean near their destination. Nearly 1 year and 6 months after she and Noonan disappeared, Earhart was officially declared dead. The mysterious nature of Earhart's disappearance has caused much public interest in her life. Her airplane has never been found, which led to a speculation of conspiracy theories about the outcome of the flight. Decades after her presumed death, Earhart was inducted and to the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 1968. The National Aviation Women's Hall of Fame in 1973. Several commemorative memorials in the United States have been named in her honor. These include a commemorative U.S. airmail stamp, a airport, a museum, a bridge, a cargo ship, what? The Earthfield Dam, a playhouse, a library, and multiple roads. Oh my God. She also has a minor planet, Planetaria Corona, a newly discovered lunar crater named after her. God, now y'all naming planets after people? Numerous films, documentaries, and books have recounted Earhart's life, and she is ranked ninth in flying list of the 51 heroes of aviation. I think I'm gonna do the black one next because she was really good.
So if you haven't heard by now, deep sea explorers may have found Amelia Earhart's long-lost plane. According to her final radio messages with the U.S. Coast Guard vessel stationed nearby, all contact with Earhart ceased on July 2nd after 8:43 a.m. And that is supposedly the last anyone has ever heard from her. Until the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TGAR, published a paper in 2018 that strongly refutes this, stating that they have ample evidence to show that Earhart sent out radio distress messages for several days after July 2nd. After Earhart disappeared, the U.S. Navy put out an all ships, all stations bulletin. Authorities asked anyone with a radio and a trained ear to tune in to the radio frequencies that Earhart was using on her trip. And this was not as simple as it sounds. So the people who heard Earhart's distress messages just happened to be listening to the radio at the right time. And one of those people was a 15-year-old girl listening in from St. Petersburg, Florida, who transcribed some of the desperate phrases she heard. Quote, "Water's high, water's knee deep. Let me out. Help us quick." A housewife in Toronto heard a shorter message. Quote, "We have taken in water. We can't hold on much longer." On July 3rd, a woman named Nina Paxton from Ashland, Kentucky, said she heard Earhart say, quote, "KHAQQ calling," and that she was on or near a little island at a point near, and then it cuts out. Then she says something about a storm and that the wind was blowing. "We will have to get out of here. We can't stay here long." What happened to Amelia Earhart after that has vexed the world for nearly 87 years. TIGAR is just one group of researchers who have dedicated their time and resources to solving one of aviation's greatest mysteries. So here's what they discovered. So they conducted an extensive analysis of more than 2,000 Coast Guard and U.S. Navy log entries and tracked down 57 credible post-loss radio messages reported in the days after Earhart's disappearance to construct a picture of what may have happened in those final days. Based on the quality of the radio messages, TIGAR deduced that the point of origin of these radio messages were coming from Gardner Island, because the quality of radio reception decreased the farther you moved away from Gardner Island. And only at Baker Island, which is the station closest to Gardner, did an operator hear a strong, clear voice signal with the plane's call sign, KHAQQ. And if you notice, the island just above Baker is Howland Island. That is the island that Earhart and Noonan were supposed to land at to refuel and never arrived. And eerily enough, Earhart's very last radio message to the U.S. Coast Guard vessel at 8:43 a.m. was her stating that she was on the line, position 157-337, running north and south. And what island happens to be on this line of position? It's Nukumaro Island, also known as Gardner Island. So TIGAR deduced that Earhart and Noonan had to basically crash land on Gardner Island and were marooned on the reef. And the reason TIGAR believed this is absolutely bonkers nutso science. I mean that in a good way. Okay, if the plane was stuck on the reef at Gardner Island, then that presented Earhart with a problem. The plane's radio relied on the aircraft's batteries, but you need the batteries to start the engine. So if they kept the radio on and continued to send distress messages, then they would run out of the battery and they wouldn't be able to start the plane. But here's the rub. The timing of the distress messages are strange. TIGAR believed that there was a pattern to them that was oddly specific, as if Earhart was only sending distress messages when the tide was out. So TIGAR hypothesized that the plane was halfway underwater, and thus Earhart could only send messages when the water level was low enough for the propeller tip to clear. Because again, she needed to turn the engine on to send the radio message. In other words, TIGAR concluded that Earhart and Noonan had to stick to a certain schedule based on the tide. They're seeking shelter, shade, and food during the day, and then they head back to the plane during low tide to try the radio message again. To test their hypothesis, TIGAR compared past tidal levels and reef height data from Gardner Reef to the post-loss signals on an hour-by-hour timeline. And in their words, the correlation was astounding. Every credible transmission only occurred when the water level was low enough for the propeller to clear. But there's even more to this story. TIGAR didn't just randomly start this investigation based solely on the post-lost radio messages. In 1940, bones were discovered on Gardner Island, which was originally believed to have belonged to Earhart, but then were, quote, misidentified and discarded. So TIGAR built this body of evidence on top of forensic anthropologist Dr. Richard Yancey's paper in 2018, which reanalyzed the bone evidence using modern-day techniques. These bones on Gardner Island were found by a British expedition team who stumbled upon a skull, other skeletal parts, and the remains of what looked like a woman's shoe. Among these bones was a box that held a Brandis Navy surveying sextant made in 1918 and a bottle of Benedictine, an herbal liqueur. I wanted to do a little bit of digging to see if Benedictine was even popular in the 1930s when Earhart was alive. And I found found out that Benedictine was one of the most popular cocktails in 1930s New York during the Prohibition. And Amelia Earhart lived in New York for a while. She went to Columbia University, and then after graduating, she continued to live there for a few years because her husband owned a publishing company there. So it's totally possible that she packed the Benedictine as part of her belongings for the flight. Anyways, the 13 bones were shipped to Fiji and were studied by D.W. Hoodless, who determined that the skeleton was a man and the bones were subsequently chucked. But since the bones are gone, Jans co-developed a computer program that can estimate sex and ancestry by using skeletal measurements, called Fordisk. Jans compared the lengths of the bones to Earhart's measurements, using her height, weight, body build, limb lengths, and proportions from both photographs and information found on her pilot's and driver's licenses. The Fordisk analysis not only found the bones were female, that Earhart's bones were, quote, more similar to the Gardner bones than 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. So in his paper, Dr. Jans says that the only documented person to whom these Gardner bones could belong to is Amelia Earhart. Although doing a proper DNA analysis on the actual bones would give us the clearest and most definitive answer, the Fordisk analysis comes pretty darn close. This, coupled with the Teagar's radio message analysis, paints a pretty compelling yet distressing picture. One can only imagine what was going through her mind in those final moments. We finally have an Amelia Earhart update, y'all. So remember back in February, I interviewed the CEO of Deep Sea Vision, who found this plane-shaped looking object at the bottom of the ocean 100 miles off the coast of Howland Island, which is where Amelia and her navigator Fred Noonan were supposed to stop to refuel before they vanished. Now, according to the Deep Sea Vision team, they strongly felt that this shape fit the shape and specs of Amelia Earhart's long-lost Lockheed 10E Electra plane. But by the time they had captured the sonar image, they were already 3 months into their trip, and it wasn't feasible to turn back to investigate further. But finally, they returned on November 1st to confirm or deny whether this plane-shaped object is, one, a plane, and two, whether it's Amelia Earhart's long-lost plane. After returning on November 1st, they formally identified this shape at the bottom of the ocean to be a natural rock formation. To be completely honest, I'm not surprised that it didn't turn out to be Amelia Earhart's long-lost plane, but I am genuinely surprised that it turned out to be a rock formation. Out of all the things that it could be, I did not expect it to be that. I genuinely thought it was going to be an anchor or some sort, because it really has that anchor shape formation, and that's exactly what Rick Gillespie theorized as well when I interviewed him. If you don't know who Rick Gillespie is, he is the head of Tiger, and they just closed out their 30-year investigation into Amelia Earhart's disappearance, which concluded that Earhart and Noonan most likely crash landed on Gardner Island, which is around 350 nautical miles away from Howland Island, from where Amelia Earhart was sending out radio distress calls for almost a week afterwards, before the team calculated that her plane was most likely swept out to sea. At which point, of course, the radio distress calls stopped. And one of the key pieces of evidence to support the Gardner Island theory versus the Howland Island theory is that they have compiled evidence of dozens of people around the US who unexpectedly picked up Amelia Earhart's final radio distress calls and picked up Amelia's voice saying things like, quote, "We crashed, taking in water, can't hold on much longer," unquote. It is truly a fascinating case that they built over the course of 30 years. I go through the entire case and interview Rick Gillespie himself. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend watching the full deep dive on my YouTube now. Here's a clip from the YouTube video for you to get a sense of how insane this story is. Why is it that Amelia and Noonan sent out distress calls only during these very specific intervals? And this is where it gets really interesting. If you look at this chart, you might notice that most of these signals came during the night, but there's no consistency or a discernible pattern to them. But Tiger was persistent. They led multiple expeditions to collect data about Gardner Island and the other islands that surround it. Then they compared past tidal levels and reef height data at Gardner Island to the post-loss distress signals on an hour-by-hour timeline. And from that, they deduce that the radio transmissions only occurred when the tide was low.
But then the tide is getting higher and higher until at one point the tide is high enough so that it will actually reach not only the prop, but the transmitter that's in the cabin. And sure enough, once that happens, there are no more signals.